Hello everyone, I'm Rebecca and welcome back to my sewing room. Today we are going to talk about how to enlarge patterns when you are not working with a gridded or a commercial pattern. So we are actually going to just take a pattern diagram, just shapes, and we are going to enlarge that to our own size, or my own size in this case. And specifically, this pattern today is one that I've been wanting to make for a while. I will be continuing this project in upcoming vlogs, so do make sure that you are subscribed and hit the bell notification so that you know when those go live. But this pattern is going to be Samantha Parkington, as in the American Girl doll, her winter cloak, which looks just like this. So this is a relatively simple garment, which is good because we are just working with shapes here. But of course, this sort of process can be applied to really any sort of pattern. And actually this cloak, it's a little bit more complicated than it might show up on camera right here. There's actually a lot of pieces to this. So this cloak has front pieces here, it has side pieces that are over the shoulder and they're darted into the shoulder, and then it has a back piece in the center. And I do have pretty wide fabric with this, so I'll be working with, I think it's like a 55-inch wide fabric, so hopefully we won't have any issues with width. But what we're going to do is we are going to take some patterns that I've printed off from online. So if you're not familiar with American Girl dolls, they are a series of dolls that started being released in 1986 and are still currently being released today, but some items like this, they're retired, they no longer exist. And so with the items that were released originally, like in the early and mid 90s, they actually released sewing patterns for the dolls as well. And all of those sewing patterns have been put online so that you can access them online, not have to find the rare uncut patterns from the 1990s. So I will link those patterns in the description below because that is what we're going to be using as our source here. And they look kind of like this. They don't necessarily print out great. Like for example, this is actually 2 pages that I have taped together where they meet so that the bottom of it here can actually fit on this page. But what we're working with here is we have kind of a scale that we can figure out how this is going to work, because I know what Samantha's measurements are, I know what the original cloak measurements are, and I know what my measurements are and what I need my cloak to be. So that's what I did as my starting point. I went through, I measured Samantha's bust, waist, and hips. I also measured across her shoulders, which is a very important measurement for this cloak. And I also measured the length of the cloak from where it meets the collar, because there's a little standing collar, so where it meets that collar all the way down to the hem, not taking into account seam allowances or anything like that. And then I did the same thing for me. So I measured across my shoulders where I would need the shoulders to hit on me, where I would need the length to hit on me, my bust, waist, hip, etc. And we are actually just going to play with some algebraic formulas. I know, more math. Sorry, but that's how we are going to scale this up. Now, all of our formulas are probably going to be quite different because I was actually pretty surprised to find out that Samantha's shoulders are more than 1/3 of my shoulder width. Like, that seems weird for a doll. Her shoulders are 7.25 inches across and mine are 20.25 inches across. Now, that measurement does not equate to the rest of the scaling up. She is pretty wide shouldered, so that is why we're going to need to apply this scaling and algebraic formula to all of these and find out exactly what we need to do. So in other words, this sort of pattern, the shoulder is going to be disproportionately scaled up to, for example, the length, because my length is more than 4 times her length. So yeah, we're gonna get a lot of weird scaling in here, but let's go ahead and apply the math first, and then we can start on redrawing the actual pattern shapes. So here's all my math scribbling. For now, we don't actually need to worry about like the full-on algebra formula because we are looking at scale. So these are the findings here. These are all of the measurements that I've taken. And so what I've done then is I've taken my measurement, like the 20.25 inch shoulder width, and divided it by her measurement, 7.25 inches, and gotten the scale of 2.79. And I've done that for all of these. So length, bust, waist, hip, etc. They are all right here. These are the scales that I'm going to be using. And the next step is to find places that are going to be done as measurements on the pattern pieces, which there are a handful of pattern pieces. So we have the back, we have the front, we have the side that has the dart in it. So that is why it's cut funky like that, because they're removing the fabric of that dart. And then we also have the collar piece over here. We'll get to the collar later because that'll be, really we'll probably only be using the shoulder scale for the collar. So that'll be a little bit nicer. But with these, we are also going to have to see if they really will fit on one piece of fabric. For example, this, it's possible that we may have to do this as an actual seam, and likewise with the back, this is done to be placed on the fold, but it is possible that we may have to place this on two pieces of fabric with a seam down the back instead. So we'll see how that goes. But again, I'm going to pick certain places where I'm going to compare what this pattern looks like onto Samantha, find where like the shoulder, bust, waist, hip, etc. are, and then use the scale to find out what I'm going to need for me. So one thing that I want to point out here that I think is pretty specific to doll patterns is that dolls, at least like this, have actually a sloped back. And so the back measurement is longer than the front measurement. It's kind of the opposite of human adult females, at least. And so the back of this cape pattern is actually longer than the front. So I'm trying to balance at the sides where things match up. So I'm matching up the side piece here to the front piece and marking where the lines come to on this piece here. And then I'll do the same thing with this side on the back, and then I'll draw the lines across here. And that will give me the measurements in all three places for the bust, waist, and hip. And that does make these lines a bit funky here in the middle because the like bust and waist difference in the front and back is quite different because of that curved back. So just something to keep in mind if you're working from a doll pattern. Again, if you're working from just like a diagram, it's not going to be quite the same as this because you'll probably have human shaping, not doll shaping. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to measure each of these lines on each of these pieces and then multiply that measurement by their ratio that we had figured out earlier. And that is how I will know approximately how large those lines should be on my piece instead of the doll piece. So two other bits. One, I decided to also take the measurements of the neckline and her neck and my neck and do that because it's a lot harder to determine where the actual shoulder is, and the neck ratio is almost the exact same as the shoulder ratio. So that was really good. And the other thing, metric friends, you can skip this, but I have the eighth one, 1/8, 3/8, etc. memorized, but I do not have the 16th. So I just like wrote a little chart out, and that way I can be a lot faster when I'm doing my calculator for finding, like 3 3/16, or 1 3/16, or 5 9/16, 15/16, etc. I can do my math a lot faster on the calculator by already having a cheat sheet set out and not having to like remember it or look it up each time, because now what I'm going to do is I am multiplying all of these by all of these, and I will find out what they equal for me. So I do have a bit of an oddity to show that, this isn't perfect, but for some reason this back pattern, the center back is shorter than the center front, whereas on the cape, the center front is shorter than the center back. So something is not quite right. I don't know if that's like a printing issue or a pattern issue or what, but the scale doesn't always work. And actually that's something else that I want to point out. Like for example, this is 10.01, this is 10.14. There's going to be more of a difference there because of the way that there's curves out, and more so this one, this is actually a smaller measurement at the waist than it is at the bust, but for a cape, that's not how it works. It goes outwards. So that just happens to be because my waist is smaller than my bust, so it's scaled that way. But we will be doing some tweaking to make it still the right shape. However, we now have the measurements on which we can start drawing out And I'm only going to pattern this down to about here for the mock-up, just so that I can see that the shoulder fits, since that's what's important to actually fit in a cape, and I don't want to waste fabric. But now we can use these measurements to go ahead and make that mock-up. So, quick error that I fell for in my mock-up, even though I know better, that I want to point out to you. I was just going to make a short version of this cloak, like ending probably about here. But as you know, we've already discussed that with the scaling of this, because it's a doll pattern, the waist is not right. Like her waist to my waist, the scaling wound up too small compared to the bust and the hip. So I started to draw it out with just my short version, and I was tapering it out to the bust and to the waist. And then I was like, you know what? I should draw in the hip just in case. The hip is wildly larger because my hip is a lot larger than my waist. I'm not a doll. So I would recommend that if you're doing something like this where it is kind of a loose garment, at least make your mock-up to your hip. I started to redraw like one of the pieces and then realized, no, I need to go to the hip with this mock-up so that I can get the angle of how it increases going down to the hem. Once I hit the hip, I will be fine. I'm literally just gonna follow that angle past the hip, but I have to go to the hip. So gotta use a little bit of more fabric on the mock-up. I am using actually pink poly matte satin left over from my 1830s Cinderella dress, and I am going to go ahead and fix that issue and make the mock-up properly to the hip. So one of the other things that I did was I found a midpoint for between the neck and the bust, because it was quite a ways, and I found the midpoint and the width of that midpoint using a scale that was directly in between the neck and the bust, since there was a good halfway point. And now I've been drawing in the lines, and you want to do a mock-up because you're gonna like sketch out the lines. At least that's what I do. I just really sketch out a line to get something similar to the pattern curve. And now we have the back mock-up that goes down to the hip measurement. When we're looking at this middle piece here, this is obviously a very, very strange shaped piece. So I think that it's easier to look at it in half. Now this is not exactly even on both sides. There is a little bit of difference in there, but I think it's going to be easier to look at it this way because now we have the straight of grain running right down the middle of the piece, and we can just draw in these edits once we get up to the top there. So in doing that, one of the measurements that you're going to want to find as far as scale goes is the distance from this point over here to the fold, because we've taken all of these measurements here, and that's great, but once we go to like fold our fabric to actually cut it, we need to know how wide we need it to be. By the way, I'm doing all of this without seam allowances when I do the math, and then I'm adding in the seam allowances because this has a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that would not scale properly to what I want, which is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So when you're measuring everything, measure from within the seam allowances. Don't measure the seam allowance here, and that way you'll just find this part, which is what you're going to want to scale up, not that. The nice thing is that these parts here, they have folded exactly in half. So all of the scaling measurements that we did before, like you can see my 23.75 right here, that is just going to get halved for this measurement here. So the dots on this center piece here, they're all rather wildly out of alignment. For example, the hip dot is here, the waist dot is way in here, bust dot's here, and then this dot that's right here, that is representing even across from where it is split down to. So right there, that is like right there. And it's also kind of helping to show this curve in the pattern. And what I was getting when I actually plotted that dot, because that was a mid scale between my neck and my bust, and the bust was a much larger scale than the neck, I wound up with a dot that made a line that made it so that this wasn't actually curved. And this is pretty significantly curved right here. So I didn't want to get rid of that curve entirely. And then if I had gone into the bust dot, it would have thrown things off even more. So I just split the difference between like all of the dots, wound up a little bit smaller than the hip, quite a bit larger than the waist, a little bit larger than the bust, and then a little bit smaller than that midpoint. And that way I'm getting the line that is very much still the shape of the pattern. And I will do my little tweak to make this underside that's underneath there, I'll make that out a little bit more, just because that has a slightly steeper curve right up here. And then again, it's like slightly more so right there. So I will do that as I am drawing this out here, but this is this pattern piece right there. So yeah, it's a funky shaped one. And again, I've just gone down to the hip right here. So again, for the front here, I've kind of deviated a bunch from my dot placement. I hit my hip dot exactly, and then I've got, that was the waist dot, the bust dot I hit exactly, and then this was kind of the midpoint dot, and it would have just curved out way, way, way too much. So again, kind of just like trial and error to get those a little bit, and we will see if those work. The one thing that I did do on here too that is quite different from this pattern is that this pattern for the front opening, it calls for just a 1/4 inch fold and then a 1/4 inch past that. And what that equates to is just serging on the edge. I don't want mine to be just serged. I want it to be folded in and finished. I also want a wider bit here. So what I'm actually doing is 2.5 inches past the fold line, and that will allow me to have 2 inches here plus a 1/2 inch to fold in, which will give me some nice lap over for that opening. And so I've added in 2.5 inches to this pattern here, and then I've got my regular 1/2 inch seam allowance down over here, and this is the front piece. So now that we've got the regular body pieces patterned, we're going to tackle the really tricky piece, which is the collar. I have folded this in half because it is even on both sides, but the trickiest thing about this, besides the fact that it's also curvy, is the fact that determining what scale we use is going to be kind of difficult, because you do probably want the length, like in the back or in the front, to reflect a bit of the length scale. But obviously you want like the neck or shoulders to be the neck or shoulder scale. So yeah, it's definitely going to be a little bit funky and probably a lot of trial and error. And I'm going to err on the larger side and then cut it down from there. But basically, like this point right here, you want this to pretty much be kind of like the apex of your shoulder, like just to the very point past your shoulder. Whereas, you know, you want this to hang down and still look really nice in the back. So that's what we're doing. If you see here, I have drawn in a whole bunch of lines, and these lines are all notating certain markers, like the largest, widest piece out here, or the narrowest piece right there, the widest piece there. This one is to this corner, this is to this corner, this is the widest part of the curve, and then this one's just kind of a midpoint. So I have marked all those out, measured them, and now I'm going to play with scale and decide how I want them scaled up. For a lot of these, like the neckline or the shoulders, you have to use the shoulder scale, or else it's just going to get way, way, way too long, because the length scale is so much larger than the shoulder scale. But I think when we come to about right here, I think I am actually probably going to use the length scale, probably for this section right here, and also this first section right here. Make sure you're not in the neck, because again, that's going to throw off your neck scale. But this little bit down here, I think we can probably play with the length scale with that. Again, it's going to be trial and error. We won't know till we try it on. So just as an example of how important it is to really take into account the different types of scaling, I have just scaled up the total length based on the length scale here, neck scale here, length scale here. And that total length came to 28.88 inches plus a seam allowance. Whereas if I had done, this was the total measured length, as in from this point to this point, and if I had done that into either of the other scales, I would have gotten 32 inches for a length scale or 20 inches for a neck scale. So this is hopefully the correct scale here, and we will move forward with that. So because my length scale is so much longer than my width scale, I'm winding up with a really long part back here and slightly long up front, and it's making it so that this is not the same shape. So I'm a little wondering if it's going to work. And to be honest, I think what I'm going to do, just to save on fabric, is like I have this line right here. So my line is already drawn in, but I think I'm actually going to draw a larger line outside of this to become more like the shape of the pattern. And then I can cut that away if that is not what I want, if I really do like this scale, but that way I don't have to recut a whole, you know, new pattern piece if I decide I do want it to be that more squatty shape out here. So now you can see the lines of that second version drawn in. I decided to draw it a little bit up front as well. The neckline area, I feel like this looks pretty good. So this was all relatively easy to, figure out, and didn't mess with scale because we were just working with the neck scale here. And so here, it's the length that was a little funky. So I'm going to cut that out, and now I'm going to sew together the pieces that we have cut out, which really, this one is just one piece all by itself, but we're going to sew together the body pieces and see then what this would look like on top of them. So I decided that I didn't want to wait to sew together the other pieces before trying on the collar, and actually it's like not bad. It is way too long in the back. I think the front length is pretty much perfect though, so I'm very excited about that. But as you can see, it's coming down to almost the lower back in the back, which is really just a lot longer than I want for this. I want it to be like probably about right up here where my finger is. Yeah, like maybe even right there. So it's definitely way too long in the back. The width I think looks pretty good. I'm a little worried that the neckline is actually too wide, because keep in mind that there is supposed to be seam allowance in this. Right now I feel like this is perfectly fitting without any seam allowance. And if I take a 1/2 inch away from it on all sides, yeah, it's gonna have some issues. I think it'll just be, frankly, too large at that point. But again, this is a really good jumping off point where I could still use this as a pattern very easily once I fix the back, and then just add the seam allowance into the neckline area. And I think it would be pretty much perfect. I think I may also want to add seam allowance right into this divot right here, just because again, if I take another 1/2 inch away, it's going to be really like a little bit above where I want on the shoulder by probably about a 1/2 inch, but again, super, super close. So I'm going to fix the back of this, and then I think we've got a running collar pattern, so that's great. Much better with the back length now, and in doing that I did taper the back width just a little bit as well, and that is great. Again, I think the front is going pretty much exactly how I want it. I am going to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. I'm actually going to add 1 inch to the back because it is even a little bit low even without the seam allowance taken out. So if I add 1 inch, it will raise me up 1/2 inch and then allow me 1/2 inch for seam allowance. So that will all be super, super easy to do though. So now let's go ahead and put together the body of the cloak. And here we are. We have the weird giant pink capelet or cloak, and it's pretty darn close to exactly what I wanted it to be. So my math was, I think, pretty on, but the one thing that I think was off was that I think I had my neck scale off, because again, the neck is just way too big. It should be like up here, especially because, it still has a seam allowance in it. So I need to add neck going up this way, both in front and in back. And I think I'm also going to taper the shoulders a little bit more too. That is a personal preference of mine. Her shoulders are out there, but I just feel like it's not particularly flattering to have your shoulders quite so out there. I don't know. I might change my mind on that. I might keep it like this. In fact, maybe I'll put the collar on and see if that makes it any better. But other than that, everything looks good. I know that it's really hard to get me all in frame here. Let me try this again. Okay, here's a little bit more of the cape. We'll cut off my head so that you can see the cape. I did not cut armholes in this mock-up, but the armholes are in this seam right here, this like side front seam, and they basically go from just about like low bust to frankly like about here, like high hip. So that is where my arm will come out through. But yeah, otherwise, all of the seams are doing nicely. I just picked random amounts for the bottom, so like the fronts are super, super long compared to like the sides, but again, that wasn't math, that was me just not cutting off the excess fabric. And also you might notice that one of these is the inside of the fabric, not the outside. This is the outside here of the satin, because I didn't want to waste extra fabric. I figured, why not? But yeah, here we are. I will be adjusting the neckline and copying that to all of my math and pattern and all of this sort of stuff. But let's look at it with the collar. Here we are with the collar. It looks kind of like a choir robe because it's out of pink satin, but the shape is there. So yeah, I'm happy with it. With the bottom of this, I will just really extend these lines out to get to the length that I want, which is just about like high calf length, and it will just get extended, but we have the pattern. So as you can see, when you are working from a non-gridded pattern, there is a lot of measuring and a lot of math involved. So I do apologize for those of you who hate math. It may not be the best idea to work with a non-gridded pattern to make clothing for yourself. But for those of you who are willing to put in that extra time and do the math and take all those measurements and everything like that, it works. Here we are. This was the doll pattern. So I hope that this video was helpful for you. If you liked this video, please go ahead and click the thumbs up icon. And if you'd like to see more videos like this from me, please go ahead and click subscribe and the little bell icon to be notified every time I post a new video. I do post videos here to YouTube twice a week, with my sewing vlogs out on Tuesdays and other costuming content like this out on Saturdays, but I post every day over on my Instagram, so please go follow me on Instagram. That's at Lady Rebecca Fashions. And if you'd like to help support all of the work that I do on this channel, I do have a link to my Patreon and my Ko-fi down in the description below. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my Edwardian level patrons, Sharon and Julie. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I will be back with more Samantha cloak content in about a week and a half, but I do have more Daniel Deronda content coming for you next week, so I do hope that you tune in then on Tuesday. And I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Happy sewing!